What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Good Wolf Project. I'm your host, Jerry Scarlato, and today I want to talk to you about a very popular idea that has been roaming around the interwebs and the news and other things lately, and that is fascism. More specifically, Hitler and fascism and how it relates potentially to Donald Trump, because what has happened definitely over the last couple of months, and it has picked steam up, I'll say, over the last couple of months, but has been going on for really years now, is the far left side of the political realm has been deeming Donald Trump a fascist and relating him to Hitler. So me and my curiosity, which sometimes curiosity kills a cat, but me and my curiosity, I wanted to see what this was all about. What was fascism? Of course, I have a general idea of what fascism is, as I guess most people do, since everyone talks about it so much, and how Hitler went about his uprising and his beliefs on nationalism and race and things like that. So I figured the best place to go for that was Hitler himself, and that's why today we're going to be using his book Mein Kampf to be able to clarify some things and be able to help us understand what parts of the government and what people of the government and what areas of the government are more closely related to ideas of fascism, and more in particular, ideas and actions that Hitler took in order to either suppress a race or in order to bring up his nation. So that leads us to, first and foremost, of course, the definition of fascism. We can't start with anything before, we can't start a conversation, we can't start in an argument, we can't start anything without definitions. We need to first start with that, otherwise we have no clue what we're talking about. And while a lot of people talk about this idea, my argument would be that most people have no clue what fascism actually is. We just hear the word fascism, and it is related to Hitler. And since we all know Hitler is a terrible person, and then he is then related to Donald Trump, that relation alone is all we really need. So I don't think most people actually know what fascism is. Maybe you have a general understanding based on its connection to Hitler, but it's mostly the connection with Adolf Hitler himself that kind of circles the whole square. So we need to start with fascism. Since you want to call somebody a fascist, then we need to start with that definition so that we can see if they fit that definition. And what we're going to do is see who fits the definition, to see what party or what conversation or what message fits the definition of fascism. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you that neither one directly fits the definition. When we go through this, you're going to be like, on a basic level, any government could be said to have like pieces and parts of fascism in it. Like, I'll go ahead and say that, and that's just the truth. Like, one of them is a regime that exalts the nation. Like, in other words, a government that brings up the nation. Now, of course, there are extreme versions of that, i.e. Adolf Hitler, but if it's a bad thing to say that the nation is a good thing and that we should, be a strong nation, then I'd like to see a strong argument for that. So there's going to be pieces and parts of this whole thing that can be related to anything, but we're going to go ahead and set that aside for now, and we're going to use it as the definition is said. So I'll say the definition, and then we'll break it down piece by piece to see where the pieces lie. So it starts with a populist political philosophy, movement, or regime, such as that of the fascisti, that exalts nation and often race above the individual. That is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. Okay, that was long, so let's break it down piece by piece, starting with the first section. A populist political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual. One of the things that Hitler, I would argue that Hitler is known for two things. Number one, of course, is the suppression and mass murder of Jewish people, which on top of that is the idea of supremacy of race. More specifically for Adolf Hitler, the Aryan race, the Germans, however you want to define it. And then the other part for Adolf Hitler is nationalism, the belief in Germany. That's what pissed him off really the most. And that his link was to Jews. He believed that the Jews are what brought down Germany in the First World War, and why Germany was so weak in the interim between the two wars, which is why he then ended up doing his thing and becoming the leader of Germany. So those are the two things that really make Hitler who he is. So if we look at those two ideas in and of themselves, do we see any correlation between our current parties in the United States? Well, I would argue on the race side, we don't see any racial supremacy arguments. The left would argue that people on the right think that whites are supreme, but you don't see that anywhere. Like there's no verbiage about it. There's no words about it. There's no ideas of strategies, tactics, no laws that want to be passed about it. There's none of that out there. You don't see it anywhere. So I don't see that on either side. On the nation or race above the individual side, that part is curious. While neither one of the parties that we have in the United States would argue for necessarily the nation or a race above the individual, the far left would argue for the community above the individual, or the sacrifice of the self for the community. So Hitler puts this a couple of ways, and I want to read a couple of passages to kind of show how he puts it. So first, he says that belief in the state-forming and state-preserving power of economics seems especially incomprehensible when it obtains in a country which in all things clearly and penetratingly shows the historic reverse. So he says that the material interests of man can always thrive best as long as they remain in the shadow of heroic virtues. But as soon as they attempt to enter the primary sphere of existence, they destroy the basis for their own existence. If, however, we consider the question, what in reality are the state-forming and or even state-preserving forces, we can sum them up under one single head: the ability and will of the individual to sacrifice himself for the totality. And there's another verse in here that sort of clarifies this idea. He goes on to say, the most wonderful elucidation of this attitude is provided by his word work, and by which he does not mean an activity for maintaining life in itself, but exclusively a creative effort that does not conflict with the interests of the community. Otherwise, he designates human activity insofar as it serves the instinct of the self-preservation without consideration for his fellow man as theft, usury, robbery, or burglary. In other words, if you're not doing something that directly influences the community and you're doing something for that brings yourself up and is somehow deemed only for your own self-preservation, then you're a thief or you're a robber. And then he goes on and says, every worker, every peasant, every inventor, official, etc., who works without ever being able to achieve any happiness or prosperity for himself is a representative of this lofty idea, even if the deeper meaning of this activity remains hidden to him. In other words, if you go out and you live your whole life and you are just a miserable being and you don't enjoy your life, you don't enjoy what you do, and you die just a miserable wretch, but it was for the good of the community, then you are an exalted human being. So what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Well, if you look at ideas that have been brought forth by Kamala Harris and the far left, a lot of the ideas are ideas about people, quote, rich people, sacrificing themselves for the good of the community. They specifically talk about the billionaires and the big corporations and so on and so forth. But my argument would be is that they don't stop there. What they really mean is they want to take everybody's money and redistribute it and make sure that we're all even and equal, no matter how hard you work, no matter what you do, so on and so forth. So the idea for debasing the individual for the betterment, quote, betterment of the community is definitely there. Now, for the left, it's not the nation. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the left is trying to kill the nation. And we can look at that very distinctly through, again, the eyes of Hitler. So Hitler was the ultimate nationalist. He believed in Germany more than I believe any human being ever believed in another nation. That may be a little bit of a far stretch, but it's not close to one. Like, he believed in Germany. He believed in the German people. He did atrocious things in order to fulfill that belief, but nonetheless, he believed in it. So he had ideas on how strong a human being should be so that the society could be strong, so that then the country could be strong. And we can look at those ideas, which, if you put nationalism on a continuum, are on the far right, the very far right, about as far as you can go. If we put those ideas on the far right, and those are the ones that are going to make for an extreme nationalist society, then we can ask ourselves, well, if we wanted to destroy the society, what would we do? Well, we would do the opposite of this. So a couple of ideas that he talks about to make the individual strong, which is completely ironic since he talks so much about sacrificing the individual for the community and how the community needs to be strong and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of irony in what we're about to go over when it comes to Hitler, because he wants the individual to be strong. He wants them to be have willpower and determination and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he wants them to sacrifice themselves. So there's a lot of disconnect there. And that kind of goes along with how things turned out with Hitler. But nonetheless, there's a couple of ideas that he talks about. So he talks about the physical development through schooling and the mental development through schooling, the focus primarily on physical development and through of mental willpower, discipline, responsibility, and determination. He also talks about the courage of the people and how to increase the courage of the people. And then finally, he talks about building the soul of a human being. Now, none of these are crazy ideas, to be sure. But again, taken to the extreme, meaning like implemented to the extreme, I think all of us would hear those ideas and be like, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Like, you would want people to be physically strong. You want them to have determination and willpower. You want them to have courage, and you want them to have a good soul. Like, all of that makes perfect sense. But implemented to the extreme, you tend to then potentially have, what happened. So let's look at what he talks about when it comes to physical development and the mental development through schooling specifically. So he says, realizing this, the focus state must not adjust its entire educational work primarily to the inoculation of mere knowledge, but to the breeding of absolutely healthy bodies. The training of mental abilities is only secondary, and here again, first place must be taken by the development of character, especially in the promotion of willpower and determination, combined with the training of joy and responsibility, and only in last place comes scientific knowledge. Here, the focus state must proceed from the assumption that a man of little scientific education, but physically healthy with a good, firm character, imbued with the joy of determination and willpower, is more valuable for the national community than a clever weakling. So again, you can hear through his words why he thinks basically a strong idiot is better off for the nation than a weak, smart person. But if, for instance, you wanted to make a nation weak, how would you do that? If that's how you potentially make a nation strong, is through strong individuals with strong willpower and strong determination, and teaching them to literally take responsibility, like imbuing that in them and building that in them, then what would you do? You do the opposite of that. So if we look at our schooling today, it is primarily focused on, quote, scientific education. They've basically taken physical education out of schools. They certainly don't teach discipline, determination, or responsibility in any sense in any school. As a matter of fact, responsibility has been taken away from almost everybody in society and basically been given to either the healthcare system, the pharmaceutical system, or the government in some sort. So if you wanted to tear down a society or a nation, what you would do is the opposite of that. You would make them unhealthy. You would make them unfit. You would make them fat. You would make them out of shape. You would make them abdicate responsibility to other people. And yet here we are doing that. Like, that's where we are as a society. We are 70% of society is overweight or obese. 50% of adults have type 2 diabetes. Many more are pre-diabetic. Something like 20 or 25% of kids have type 2 diabetes. Like, it's freaking crazy. It is crazy. So if we wanted to tear down a nation, that's one step that we could take. If we wanted to take the opposite side of an extreme nationalist. So another thing that we could do is take the courage away from people, or try not to build people up into courageous beings. So here's what Hitler has to say about that. He says, consequently, the question of regaining German power is not how shall we manufacture arms, but how shall we manufacture the spirit which enables a people to bear arms? If the spirit dominates a people, the will finds 1,000 ways, every one of which ends up in a weapon. But give a coward 10 pistols, and if attacked, he will not be able to fire a single shot. And so for him, they are more worthless than a knotted stick for a courageous man. Again, taken to the extreme, things can spiral quickly in the wrong direction. But if you basically tell a society and tell a people and raise a people to believe that you are a victim of others, you're a victim of big corporations that take advantage of you, you're a victim of rich people who take advantage of you, you're a victim of a system that doesn't support you and only puts you down. Victim, victim, victim. If you constantly are telling people that they're victims, they're not going to have any courage or willpower or want to do anything of any sort. Why would you want to do that if you feel like the world is completely against you? There are very few people that can push hard against that idea. There are very few, very, very, very few people who can push hard against the idea. And I would argue that most of those people are psychopaths. So if you are brought up and constantly told that, we'll take care of you, you just don't have to do anything, the system is rigged against you, here's how all these things work against you. Like, if you look at the racial nonsense that the far left talks about and the victimhood that they basically build into these different racial groups, it's no wonder that many of them don't want to try harder than they do. Like, they're basically told that the man brings them down. Like, the white man brings you down, everybody brings you down. That's why you are where you are. Why would you want to try? Like, why would you want to try? So, if we wanted to tear down a nation, that's another way that we could do that. And here we are. Okay, which brings us to the last point, and that is building the soul of the human being. So, he says, thus, the whole system of education must be so organized as to use the boy's free time for the useful training of his body. He has no right to hang about in idleness during these... that's not the one that I wanted to read. Let me backtrack. Here we go. Okay. Parallel to the training of the body, a struggle against the poisoning of the soul must begin. Our whole public life today is like a hothouse of sexual ideas and stimulations. Just look at the bill of fare served up in our movies, vaudeville, and theaters, and you will hardly be able to deny that this is not the right kind of food, particularly for the youth. In shop windows and billboards, the vilest means are used to attract the attention of the crowd. Okay. So to build up the soul, you surround them with things that build up the soul, and you take away the things that are vices and, don't help support that means. Taken to the extreme, that can be a very ostentatious life, which would be miserable to say the least, because we all enjoy some sort of vice, of course, from time to time. And yet, when you look at where we are in society, we literally have a device in our hands all the time that is feeding us a bunch of smut. That's just constantly feeding us nonsense. That is degrading our souls. That is degrading our will as people. That's degrading our, so on and so forth. The big food industry that is constantly literally feeding us junk, that is building these foods and creating these foods through scientific means to find the bliss point, the perfect mixture between salt, fat, and sugar, the perfect connection of those in texture that bring this lovely feeling to your mouth so that you feel addicted to it, so that you want more of it, which is all very real, by the way. You can find books about it. One of them called The Dorito Effect, which I highly recommend that you go and read. So all of that is very real, and all of that is abundant in society. So, hey, if you wanted to tear down a society, what would you do? You would support the means for that to be able to happen. And who does the government support? These companies that literally build these things that drag down society. So, like I said, I would argue that you're right that the left definitely is not fascist in the way that they bring up the nation and they believe in the nation over everything else. I would argue they're trying to kill the nation, but they do believe in the sacrifice of the self for the community, which in its own roundabout way is a fascist idea. The sacrifice for yourself for the betterment of the community. Because guess who defines betterment? Guess who defines it? Do you think someone else defined betterment when it came to working with Adolf Hitler? No, homeboy defined it. So you don't get to define betterment of the community. Someone else gets to define it for you. So these are things worth thinking about when we're trying to make these connections. All right, that brings us to the second part of our definition of fascism. That is, so a populist political philosophy, movement, or regimen that exalts nation and often race above the individual. We just went over that. The second part is that is associated with a centralized autocratic government, which means basically a government ran by one person, headed by a dictatorial leader. That is that one person. So again, on either side, I think this is the one that the left is really talking about when they talk about Donald Trump as a fascist. They believe that he's trying to be this dictatorial leader and this dictatorial, person that runs his autocratic government. I don't see it anywhere. It doesn't seem like a thing that has been said. He has been president before, and as the argument goes, if he could have done it then, why didn't he do it then? Why didn't he implement other regulations and things that would allow him to then do that later? Like, why would that not happen? Of course, you just never know. But nonetheless, there's no real connection there that shows any of that. And I would say on the left, the same thing. Like, there's not one person. Like, Kamala Harris isn't trying to be a dictator. I don't think. Joe Biden wasn't trying to be a dictator. Anything before that, it doesn't seem like that's the case. What does seem to be the case is that while there's not a person that necessarily wants to come and rule over everybody, there is a ideology that wants to come and rule over everybody. And I would argue that that ideology isn't necessarily a leftist ideology. It is a almost now governmental overarching ideology, which is why most people in the government don't like Donald Trump, right, left, or anywhere else in between. Especially all these, Dick Cheney and all these other people who were conservatives and so on and so forth that have come out and support Kamala Harris. The connection that you see with all of them is many of them have been around for a long time, or their parents were around for a long time in the case of some of them. And so the ideology that's really within them is this ideology of the conservation of the government, the conservation of the thing itself. And to conserve the government, you need to continue to build it and grow it. You can't let somebody come in and sweep it away. And potentially, that's what's going to happen with Donald Trump, is if he has people like RFK Jr. and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and other people like that are on board, that have talked openly about going and taking apart certain, FBI, CIA, like certain things within the government, taking them down, like shrinking their budgets, or just shrinking the organization itself, or completely eliminating it. With people like that, it's scary for a government that wants to maintain its power as a government, as an entity. So while it's not a person per se, it is an ideology that wants to maintain control. It is a government ideology that wants to maintain control, and that is generally a socialistic government ideology. And that's just brass, like when it comes down to it, that's what it is. Because without the government being in everyone's pockets and in everyone's life, it can't maintain control as well. And that's why this is so important. Like, that's why people are up in arms. That's why the people in the government are up in arms against Donald Trump. Because he is an outsider. He's not a politician. He's not been in the system for years. Politicians that have been in the system for years, no matter what, that's why they're called rhinos, Republicans in name only. There are an abundance of them in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. There are an abundance of them. So it is an ideology of keeping the government as a whole, the way that it is, growing and in control. Okay? Not a person, not one single puppet necessarily, but an ideology. All right. So that leads us to the next part of our definition. So we just went over the autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation. Severe economic and social regimentation. Regimentation simply means government regulation, essentially, or government rule, essentially is what that means. Okay? So characterized by severe economic and social regimentation. Now, if you look at that, you go, well, the government regulates a lot of things, which is true, but we do have a free market. We are a capitalistic society, quote, unquote. But if you look at other definitions of fascism, what's interesting is many of them say it is a capitalistic society that is highly regulated by the government or highly ruled by the government. So if you look at really what we have, it is a capitalistic society that is highly regulated and ruled by the government. And unless you dig into that and you've been in business and you deal with the inner outer working, not that I've been in like big gigantic organizations and dealt at that realm of it, but I do most definitely understand it. And I do understand tax and regulation and all of that. If you look at that, then you understand why things are as expensive as they are and why prices go up on things. And why, it's harder to grow and build a good quality business, especially in certain industries, in certain sectors, today than it was years ago. So if you look at regulations, for instance, regulations on an industry or on a sector of business, what do they do? Well, if you look at the one thing that they're trying to fix, then what they might fix is air pollution, or they might fix water pollution, or they might fix some other thing that people derive as important. And that's one thing that may potentially fix. Now, the irony is that many of these, not all of them, but a lot of them don't actually improve these metrics as much as we tend to believe, or we're led to believe that they do. But what you don't see is the downstream effects of regulations and taxes and things like that. And the downstream effect is always falls to the taxpayer, which is you. So if a company has a regulation that they have to deal with, that costs them money. It costs them resources. Resources are just things that are needed in order to develop the business and make the business happen. One of them is money, another one is time. So it costs a business money and time. And when it does that, in order for the business to still make money and be profitable and stay in business, it has to charge a certain amount for its product. So if more regulations are poured onto it, for whatever reason, to try and fix whatever, if more regulation is poured onto it, guess what happens? That costs them more money, costs them more time, and what has to happen is that the company has to then raise their prices. It's not that they're greedy. It's not for any other reason, but the company has to raise their prices. Now, the other part of this is, which is trickier, is that there are a lot of really, really, really big companies that kind of stuff really doesn't matter for them. You know, they can kind of do whatever. Like Big Pharma, for instance, they set aside some astronomical amount for lawsuits and things like that, and regulatory slaps on the back, like, oh, you did this wrong. Like $100 million, hundreds of millions of dollars, I think. I can't remember exactly the number, but let's say it's $100 million. They set aside a year for that because they just expect that it's no big deal. Like $100 million, cool. We'll go ahead and set that aside, and we'll go ahead and whenever we get a regulation audit and something comes back, we'll just pay it and we'll just keep moving forward. So for like the really big companies, that stuff doesn't matter. They'll pay the fee, they'll pay the fine, and they'll just keep going. But for somebody who's trying to come up, it makes it much more challenging to get in the upper tiers or to compete with some of these companies. So if you look at like big food companies, Kraft and the like a lot of the reason why they stay on top and don't have a whole lot of competition and they just end up eating up the competition is because a lot of the competition, maybe they get to a point where it's like they're trying to overcome all these issues and regulations and taxes and things like that, and they just can't, and they just seems like it's easier to go ahead and just sell to these guys instead of try and push through and actually get to a level of being able to compete with them. So it's much more insidious in a way because you really don't see it. So I would argue that doesn't necessarily mean that those companies charge more for their product. We still have a significantly low cost of living, thanks to a lot of these big companies, for sure. I would argue it's a problem because it could be better. We could have better options, and it could potentially be better. Like we could potentially have even better cost of living if there were more competition amongst some of these bigger companies. So things like government regulation, which is everywhere and kills every kind of business, and things like government taxes and things along those lines, which are very much ingrained in society, they don't do any good, and is very much a part of our government today, and a very much big reason why people in the government today don't want Donald Trump to get in, because he will eliminate a bunch of those regulations, which will save you a bunch of money. Bad thing? No, don't think so. Okay, so that is whether or not you want to call that severe economic regimentation, maybe it's not severe, but it's definitely economic regimentation. In other words, government regulation of the economy is definitely there. Severe, it's up to the person, but it's definitely there. And it costs the end consumer. It doesn't save them, it costs them. The other part of that is social regimentation. In other words, how much is the government telling us what to do and telling us how to live our lives? And if you look at like a day-to-day basis, it's kind of low, and certainly there are examples. But there was an experiment lately. You may have been part of this thing called COVID, in which this thing came in, and it was contagious. And we were told that it was this virus that was going to wipe out society. And so we were told to do a bunch of things during this time for years, for a long time. We were told a lot. We were told to wear masks. We were told to stay away from each other, 6 feet. We were told for a time, you got to stay home. You can't go anywhere. If you did go anywhere, if you left your state, and you were caught, or if you were out past curfew, so on and so forth, there was a lot that we were told. So when you look at these things, that's all social regimentation. That is government telling us what to do. Now you go, well, Jerry, that's clearly it made sense because it was COVID and man, it was a scary time. Well, on the other part of that, now, hindsight being what it is, we see that all of that was wrong. There's been plenty of talk from many of the leaders that told us to do those things back in the day that said, oh yeah, by the way, masks, they apparently don't do as much as we thought that they did. As a matter of fact, it seems like they don't really do anything because the particle size was too small. COVID was much smaller particle size, and those masks just didn't really seem to block them. So there's that. Staying 6 feet away, yeah, it turns out someone just kind of made that number up. We don't really know why or where it came from or anything like that. Oh, and COVID's kind of like the flu, is really what it's kind of like. Certainly, if you are older than 65 or if you have comorbidities, you are definitely, you have a higher likelihood of having a severe negative reaction to it. But other than that, yeah, pretty much everybody's going to be okay. That's what it turned out to be. But guess what? They turns out they knew all of that throughout the time. But yet they told us to do all these things anyway. So the conspiracy theorist in me would say it was kind of a test to see if they could tell us what to do and we would do it. And sure enough, a lot of us did. As a matter of fact, so I'll never forget the time when we were just in COVID lockdown, maybe a couple weeks into it, and I didn't wear a mask anywhere. And I went to the store and I'm walking around and I'm sitting there looking at something and I hear this mumbling behind me. And I'm like, I look around and all I see is a lady. So I walk to the other part of the aisle, try and get the rest of the things that I need. And the lady comes to me again and I hear this mumbling and I'm like, I look at her and she's mumbling mask. She go, mask, mask, mask. And I just look at her and I just start laughing. And I just walked away. There was nothing I could say. And yet, because the government created this division amongst people, it was there. It was there and it was real. So the government was testing how much they could throw something out and a group of people would take it to real heart and then start to push back on other people, which, as we'll see in a little bit, is directly from the playbook of old Adolf Hitler himself. But to get back to what we were talking about, that is one form of social regulation. Like that was 2 years of social regulation. 2+ years for many people. So, and that was extreme. Like that was definitely extreme social regulation. No questions asked. No questions asked. So while on our daily life, it doesn't seem like it's there, and certainly there are examples of that around, for sure, it was tested then. And it was an experiment to see what would happen. What happens moving forward, I can't tell you. Why it was an experiment? For whatever happens down the road, I don't know what that is. But it was there nonetheless. So that brings us to the last part of our definition of fascism to see where we are. The last part is severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. This, of course, was something that Hitler was a big fan of, was the suppression of opposition. So let's see what he has to say about this. He says, the philosophy is intolerant. It cannot content itself with the role of one party beside another, but imperiously demands not only its own exclusive and unlimited recognition, but the complete transformation of all public life in accordance with its views. It can therefore not tolerate the simultaneous continuance of a body representing the former condition. He goes on to say, since a philosophy of life is never willing to share with another, it cannot be willing either to collaborate in an existing regime which it condemns, but feels obligated to combat this regime in the whole hostile world of ideas with all possible means. That is, to prepare its downfall. So essentially what Hitler's saying there is that if you don't agree with what he's saying, then you need to either come over and agree with what we're saying, or else we're just going to take care of you in some way or other. And then the ideology that kind of encompasses what you're saying and what you think, we're going to go ahead and wipe that off. Like we're going to go and pretend like that was never a thing and go ahead and just set that aside and, pretend like that ideology isn't there. So that's what he's saying. If you look at a lot of what the far left says, a lot of it is about and regarding disinformation or misinformation. And there is a lot of talk about suppressing free speech now. A lot of it. Now the question is, who defines misinformation? The next question after that is misinformation a new thing? So for that question, is misinformation a new thing? The answer is most definitely no. Like misinformation, what the hell kind of word is that? Fake. What do you want to call it? That's not true. Misinformation. Okay, whatever. So that's been around since the beginning of time. Great. It's not new, but all of a sudden it needs to be suppressed. All of a sudden misinformation needs to be suppressed, and free speech is maybe not the best thing to have because there's all this misinformation out there. Guess what? It's been out there. Whatever you want to define it as. And that's the question, is who defines it? As it is spoken right now, again, it's not you or me that defines it. It's not society. It is a small subset, a small group of people, of which that small group of people can say whatever the fuck they want to say, misinformation or not. But anybody outside of that small group of people, if they say anything that is not what they deem to believe is fact, or what they want you to believe is fact, then they can do something about it. Otherwise, what would misinformation be? Like, what is misinformation? What is who says what that is and what is it? So most definitely there is it's not forcible yet. Forcible means that it is there and it is currently happening. While it is not there and currently happening, there is definitely a leaning towards suppression of opposition. Suppression of different ideas than their own. That is real. That is happening right now as we speak, as you're listening to this. The idea to amend or take away or whatever, change free speech, the Free Speech Amendment, the idea to change that is very real and talked about very regularly. So while it's not forcibly put upon us yet, actually, now that I think about it, I would argue that it is. Because PC, or political correctness, has been around for how long now? And for how long how much has political correctness been stretched? Has been stretched to the point where it's like, what can you really say without somebody getting their feelings hurt? Or what can you really say without, making someone angry, or without potentially getting in trouble, or without whatever? Like, what can you really say? So, I don't know. I would kind of argue that it is forcibly put upon us. Like, suppression of opposition has definitely happened. Not that that's opposition, but it is maybe just what you're talking about, or what you're thinking, or like the words that you would normally, whatever. So it kind of is being forced upon us. But the extreme version of that, the suppression of free speech, that is not there yet. And I hoped that we don't get to that point. If you want to say lies, like, cool. It's up to me and you to decide what we think is true. The problem is, many a society, which we'll see, we'll see what Adolf has to say about influencing a society and how that is related to today. But many people in society, they just don't go do it. Like, they don't do their own thinking. They don't do their own thinking. They don't go take the time to look and see I wonder if that's something that I should be thinking about. Oh, look, there's 25 articles that actually say the opposite. Okay, turns out that that's not actually a thing. I can actually go look and find results on what is real and what's not. So, at any rate, I would argue that that's really the crux of the issue, is that, like, individuals are not proactively going out and doing their thing. If we want to take responsibility, which this is like taking away free speech, is another taking away of responsibility. It's just another version of that. But if we really want freedom and democracy, as it has been defined up until this point, then it starts with taking responsibility for our lives. It starts with taking responsibility for what we think and what we understand to be real or not real. That it starts with us. Sure, can there be things that can be done? I'm sure there are. But does it start with, like, hey, we can't have free speech? That's pretty extreme. That's pretty extreme. All right, so that is our definition game, the definition of fascism, and a little breakdown of where the connection is within our current political system. So one of the questions that is regularly asked about Germany during the time of Hitler's uprising is, how in the world could so many people be bamboozled by, which, by the way, if you get that reference, good for you, but how is it that people can be bamboozled by Hitler? Like, so many millions and millions and millions of people be bamboozled by this guy that clearly didn't want good things to happen to a large swath of people. So how many, and the general, like, answer is like, well, they couldn't have been that smart, or, that was whatever, 80 years ago, and those people were dumber than we were, or, whatever other, it's some excuse that has to do with them not being smarter than they actually were. Guess what? We have not gotten any smarter. If anything, we've gotten dumber since then. We're still human beings, and yes, we still easily are bamboozled. As a matter of fact, it was, what what's his name? Anyway, I'll think of his name in a second. But he said, Richard Feynman. It was Richard Feynman that said, the goal is to not fool yourself, and you are the easiest one to fool. That is the case today. That was the case 10 years ago. That was the case 80 years ago. That was the case 1,000 years ago. So that will always be the case. And yet, there are people out there that will continuously strive to bamboozle others, other individuals, and masses of people. So if you want to know the answer to how do a mass of people get bamboozled and tricked in such a way that they're like, yeah, this is a great idea, let's go and do this, and then all of a sudden it turns out to be this treacherous thing, well, there's a playbook for it, and it is called Mein Kampf, and there is plenty of stuff in here about it. So to start with, how do you first convince people to do a thing? How do you first convince people that this is the way that it is done? So let me see if I can find my page here. I don't think that's the one I want. Oh yeah, okay, here we are. So he says, after my entrance into the German Workers' Party, I at once took over the management of propaganda. I regarded this department as by far the most important for the present. It was less important to rack on one's brains over organizational questions than to transmit the idea itself to a large number of people. Propaganda had to run far in advance of the organization and provide it with the human material to be worked on. In other words, it's much more important to go and convince a bunch of people of some ideas. We'll come up with the ideas on actually how to figure it out later. Which, if you kind of listen to many of the speeches of politicians, most politicians, as a matter of fact, and a lot of Kamala Harris's speeches, you'll hear the same. There's a bunch of like ideology, but not a whole lot of how do you fill the void of the ideology. But there's a reason for that. So to understand the reason, let's see what the purpose of propaganda is. Hitler says, the function of propaganda does not lie in the scientific training of the individual, but in calling the masses' attention to the certain facts, processes, necessities, etc., whose significance is thus the first time placed within their field of vision. The whole art consists in doing this so skillfully that everyone will be convinced that the fact is real, the process necessary, the necessity correct, etc. But since propaganda is not and cannot be the necessity in itself, since its function, like the poster, consists in attracting the attention of the crowd, and not in educating those who are already educated or who are striving after education and knowledge, its effect, for the most part, must be aimed at the emotions and only to a very limited degree at the so-called intellect. So he essentially says that the purpose of propaganda is just to convey a simple message simply, not to try and explain anything to anybody, not to actually tell anybody what you're going to do, not to tell anybody why you're going to do it, not to do anything like that, but to be very simple about it, be very basic about it, and to just say, this is what this is. This is to say things very simply and very plainly. Okay? So I would say that there are 3 things on how to propaganda. In other words, propaganda 101, basically there are 3 things that Hitler tells us you need to do. Number 1 is a low intellect message. Number 2 is it's emotionally driven. Number 3, it is repetitive. Okay? Low intellect message, emotionally driven, repetitive. It's low intellect because the people you're talking to, so he says, are low intellect. They are not smart. They are dumb. They are stupid. They are low intellect. And since they are human beings and they're beastly, they are driven by emotion, which is why it needs to be emotionally driven. And since many people aren't smart enough to hang on to an idea long enough to take 2 steps, that's why it needs to be repetitive, because then it is just ingrained in them over and over and over again. And if you say a thing long enough, often enough, and loud enough, then eventually people will believe it. That's another thing that he says in here. So Let's take a look at these pieces and parts for 1 second, and then we'll bring it back to today's world. He says, all propaganda must be popular, and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Consequently, the greater the mass it is intended to reach, the lower its purely intellectual level will have to be. But if, as in propaganda for sticking out of war, the aim is to influence a whole people, we must avoid excessive intellectual demands on our public, and too much caution cannot be exerted in this direction. The more modest its intellectual ballast, the more exclusively it takes into consideration the emotions of the masses, the more effective it will be. And this is the best proof of the soundness or unsoundness of a propaganda campaign, and not success is pleasing a few scholars or young aesthetes. So essentially, again, what he's saying is that don't say big words, don't say big long descriptions. Keep it short, keep it simple. People just aren't smart enough, and especially the bigger the crowd, the simpler you need to keep it. Like, you need to be able to convince the smallest, dumbest of people in the crowd. So, really big crowd, keep it very simple. But make sure that it is emotionally driven. Make sure it connects to the basic human needs, the basic human emotions. Which, if you listen to the last, not the previous episode, but the one before that, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our basic needs at the bottom, and then the needs right above it, needs for like safety and security and things along those lines. When people talk about those things being in danger, that's when human beings become really emotionally driven. When we think that we are unsafe, when we think that we are in danger, when we think bad things are going to happen to us, we become, emotionally driven. So I ask you, when you look at the overall message from the far left versus the right, which one is more emotionally driven? Which one? Not that it's only, like both of them are emotionally driven to a degree for sure. But when you look at the far left messaging is extremely, like directly emotionally driven. Like either, hey, if you're for us, it's joy and it's happiness and it's love and it's compassion. It's all these things, all these emotions, all these feelings. And that's literally the message, the basic, low intellect message. But when we're talking about Donald Trump, what are we talking about? Hey, the guy's going to kill everybody. Your safety is, it's going to be bad. And it's, you're literally talking about how he's going to be Hitler and how bad, terrible things are going to happen. And all of our lives are at stake. These basic human things that pull out this strong emotion in humans, that's exactly what they're talking about. Emotional. Okay. What else do we say here? Let me try that again. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. Let me read that again. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. The consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. Okay? So, again, the masses are dumb. They forget very easily. Make sure you say things in little pithy statements and you repeat them over and over again. If you look at, if I were more technologically advanced, I would go ahead and put in some of these clips. So there are some interesting clips, and I'm sure you can go find them pretty easily. Whenever there's been like random times when things have happened to Donald Trump, when all of a sudden the media and politicians all literally start saying the same thing. Literally the same thing. And there are clips where it's like, 50 people saying the same thing, same line, same word, same phrasing, same everything from the media and from politicians. Same thing. Do you think that that's an accident? Adolf Hitler just told you, if you want to convey a message to a public, to a masses, here's how you do it. You say things in slogans and you repeat it. You repeat it so often until the very last person knows what you're trying to say. And that's what you do. And that's how it's done. And that's how you turn a people. That's how you turn a mass of people. That's how you make them and drive them to your idea. Now, the problem we're in today, or at least the problem as seen by the far left who want to suppress free speech, is that the curtain is pulled back. And people can go find facts. People can go think for themselves if they choose. They can go research. They can go look for things. They can go do that. That's the problem. From the point of view from the left. When Hitler was going through, when that was all happening, they didn't have the internet. They probably had libraries, but many of the people in Germany probably didn't. It's probably not a regular thing they went and did. Maybe they read the newspaper. But guess was one of the main things that he talks about gaining control of so that you can control the masses? The newspaper. That's one of the first things that he talks about buying and purchasing as his party is growing is a newspaper. It's one of the first things that they purchase is a newspaper. So even if they had and they read the newspapers back then, guess who the newspaper was controlled by? So back then it was, I would say, much easier to bamboozle people. Today, it's more challenging because the curtain is pulled back, because you can, there's two sides to it. The curtain's pulled back. So if someone throws something out there that seems controversial and a conspiracy, and the problem with conspiracies lately is that we've been running out of them because they have been coming true, but nonetheless, whenever that happens, it's like you can say, well, that's just conspiracy. But there could also be a lot of truth in it. So that's a problem. But at the same time, as an individual, you can go look and you can go search and you can go find and you can go seek and you can dive and you can do on so and so. You can do these things. But as the far left knows and understands, human nature is not to go do that. Human nature is not to go search and seek and look and find. It is to just listen and listen. Like that's just the way that it is. So you have to proactively do these things. You have to choose to do it. It's not to say that you have to spend hours doing it. It's not to say that you have to go and deep dive into things, but you have to do some level of thinking for yourself. You have to do some level of doing and looking and thinking. Now, I can say that all I want, and the 5 people listening to this are going to go, cool, yeah, I might go try. No, I'm kidding. There's 6 people listening. But nonetheless, that's going to continue to be human nature. It is to find the easiest path. It's to find the shortest path and the least resistance from point A to point B. And generally speaking, the easiest path is to listen to someone say something and take it as a fact. That's the easiest path. I would love to believe that humanity that part of humanity would change, and it could happen. But thus far, up until this point of humanity has been around for many hundreds of thousands of years. That has not been the case. And actually, it's gotten worse because we have gotten more comfortable, which is another discussion in and of itself. But since this episode has already dragged on longer than it probably needs to, I'll go ahead and wrap up by saying that the goal in all of this is not to, my goal isn't to, scare you in any way. Is to get you to think. That is my ultimate goal. Clearly, I have my idea and my viewpoint of how I think things are. I just conveyed it to you. It's up to you to decide if it's something that you want to think. Now, Adolf Hitler would tell me that's a stupid thing to say. You have to be definitive about what you say. You have to say it definitively, and you cannot question it. You cannot think any differently. You cannot say any differently. If you question yourself, the second you question yourself, then the masses will question you, and then it'll be over. So when you say something, you have to say it definitively, and it has to be what you say, and that has to be the end of it. You cannot question. It cannot be, oh, I might be wrong. It has to be this the way that it is. But the truth of the matter is, I might be wrong. Like, I'm not trying to be Adolf Hitler. I'm not trying to be the far left. I'm not trying to be any of that. I'm trying to get you to think. I want you to think for yourself. That's what I want you to do. So go out and do that. Share this with somebody else who also, maybe you're like, hey, I think you need to think for yourself a little more. Or maybe they're like teetering on like, I don't understand what any of this stuff, what's going on with like all this politician stuff. I don't know. Like, share this with somebody that you know could benefit from it. Share this with them so that they can start to think for themselves too. That's what this is about. It is about being you. It is about being the individual. It's about being the best version of yourself, thinking for yourself so that you can grow, you can prosper, and be in an environment that allows you to grow and prosper and not one that suppresses you and drags you down. That's what it's about. Until next time, get out there, get going. Here's to your 1% growth every day. Shoo.